In this lesson, I'm going to introduce a process-based decision model, which really is going to inform all our activities in analytics. So it's important to realize that we just don't do analytics for analytics' sake. We just don't start with a data set and go fishing looking for insights. That almost never works. A better approach is to start with a decision. So to motivate this a little bit, let's consider my friend Doug. So Doug owns a large retail store, and through his periodic financial reporting, through his income statement, he has noticed that his sales are up, but his profits are down. Now, it's important to notice that this gap between expected sales and actual sales is relative to some benchmark, and this benchmark is last year's sales. So he's noticed a gap between what he wants and what is actually happening, and the question then is, what should he do about the problem? Fortunately, there are many different models of analytics that can give Doug a bit of a roadmap to help him use analytic tools to solve his problem. Now, this model is from the Gartner Group, which is sort of a consultancy, and it falls along two dimensions. Along the horizontal axis, we have the difficulty of the technique, whereas along the vertical axis, we have the value to the organization. So not surprisingly, as the tools become more difficult to use, they also become more valuable. And that's really what we want to do in this course, is sort of climb our way up this ramp to the more valuable tools. Now, the simplest stage, the first stage, is what Gartner calls descriptive analytics. It's basically what happened. Then, as we move to the right, we start to ask, why did something happen? And they call that diagnostic analytics. Then we get into predictive analytics, which is, of course, predicting about the future, what will happen given a set of assumptions and trends. And then the final stage, which is labeled prescriptive analytics, is at the optimization end of the scale. It's basically saying, what actions do I need to make as a decision maker to have something happen, to have the desired outcome? So we have this continuum from very basic descriptive analytics all the way up to prescriptive analytics and optimization. Now, it turns out that I prefer to use a different model of analytics than the Gartner model. I'll call this the furnace repairman model, because I think all tradespeople, all furnace repair people, either learn this formally through a troubleshooting course, or they learn it informally through the process of doing their job. It basically has a few steps, and the mapping with the Gartner model is pretty straightforward. But what we start off with is this broader idea of objectives, trade-offs, and constraints. That's not in the Gartner model. And it's really saying that as decision makers, we really need to be focused first and foremost on our objectives. Then within our objectives, we might see these gaps appear. So we have this step called gap analysis, and it's basically this descriptive analytics. What happened? But notice that gap analysis can also have a predictive element. You can have gaps that you think will emerge if things keep going the way they are going. So gap analysis is a very general stage where you identify that you have a problem that requires managerial action. The next step of the model is root cause analysis. So this is very similar to the diagnostic element of the Gartner model. Why did something happen? What are its underlying root causes? And it should make sense to you that you can't really solve a problem or go off and make decisions until you understand or have at least some sense of what these root causes are. Now, the next step, once you know the root causes of a problem, is to generate alternatives. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to say much about that in this course because that's ultimately a creative process. But it should make sense to you that the quality of your decisions is very much influenced by the quality of the alternatives that you or your team generate. Now, the final step is evaluate and select. And here is where you predict what's going to happen. So there's this predictive element, and then evaluate what that means in terms of your objectives and constraints. And then selection, actually making a decision, should then just be a trivial matter of sorting your evaluations and saying, look, this alternative is the best. And we're going to walk through this now in the context of Doug's problem. Our starting point here is the step labeled objectives, trade-offs, and constraints. Now, this isn't really a step in the decision process, but more a background or an environment. It provides the entire context for the decision process. And what this means is that every organization and every individual has a set of objectives and constraints that are independent of a problem. So, for example, here with Doug, before he even knows he has a problem, he has some underlying fundamental objectives, like he wants to be respected in his community. He wants to earn a good living. He wants to treat people fairly. And there may be some other things. But these are independent of the problem, and these allow him to recognize when a problem arises. A gap occurs when the actual state of the world differs from the expected or desired state of the world in terms of these fundamental objectives. So gap analysis is the process by which we spot these gaps with respect to our goals. If a gap exists, well, then we have a trigger for managerial action. But if the gap doesn't exist, or if it's an illusion, then no managerial action is warranted. Now, in this case, during the routine process of going through his financial reports, Doug recognized that his profitability seemed to be lower than that in past years. So the desired state of the world is steady or growing profitability. The actual state of the world is declining profitability. And since profitability is one of Doug's core objectives in terms of making a living, this is apparently an important gap and is worth his managerial time and effort to track down. Now, gap analysis sounds very easy, but there are a number of challenges in practice. For example, the data is often very hard to interpret. For example, financial statements are famously difficult to make sense of for mortal people. Often the data is noisy. That is, the signal, the true issue, is hidden within data that seems random or difficult to make sense of. And then, of course, there's other issues like seasonality or intermittency, which make gap analysis a little harder than you might think. Let's assume that we establish that a gap does exist. That is, we have some problem which is threatening our core fundamental objectives. Now, most organizations and many individuals, when faced with a problem, then jump way ahead in the model to solutions and running around madly in all directions, implementing stuff. We're not going to do that. We're going to be like the disciplined furnace repairman, and we're going to stop and say, well, if we have a gap, what are its causes? So going back to Doug's example, he's got a gap in profitability. What could be causing this? Well, it could be his cost structure, perhaps. His payroll costs have gone up. Another hypothesis is that it's due to theft, what they call inventory shrinkage. But even within that, there's different types of theft. There could be theft by customers through, for example, shoplifting, but there also can be employee-based theft. And you should probably recognize that the solutions to employee-based theft are very different from the solutions to customer-based theft. So this is why it's absolutely critical to be sure or at least reasonably certain, what is causing the underlying problem before jumping ahead to solutions and implementations. Now, as before, there are many challenges to good root cause analysis. One, for example, is the need for meaningful metric. If we go back to this payroll cost issue for a second, we can see that, payroll costs may rise, but remember, Doug's sales were also rising. So maybe a more meaningful metric isn't just payroll cost, but payroll cost as a percentage of overall sales. These kind of things need to be thought about. The other issue, of course, is complex correlations and interactions. Maybe those increasing payroll costs are what are driving the increased revenue. That is, you've got better employees, or you're paying your managers better, or you've implemented new programs. So you have to understand all those interdependencies. And then finally, especially in the theft issue, it's important to recognize that people are willfully deceiving you. That is, they're trying to hide the root cause of the loss of profitability, of course, because they're stealing from you, they're embezzling or whatever. So you'll see that root cause is often one of the most challenging parts of the decision process. And fortunately, it is the one area in which modern analytics offers the most help, and we'll of course see that later in the course. I said previously that the objectives, trade-offs, and constraint step is less a discrete stage in the decision process and more a continuous process of refinement. And this is because after we've completed gap analysis and root cause analysis, we have a much better understanding of the specifics of our decision problem. So let's consider Doug's case again, and let's assume that root cause analysis has identified customer-based shrinkage as a root cause of the profitability problem. That is, Doug has pretty good evidence that customers are stealing from his store and that the impact is significant. So now Doug's task is to refine his objectives in the context of this more specific decision problem. Now, obviously, some objectives, like maintain profitability, are going to remain because they're core and fundamental. But now we have other objectives that only really make sense in the context of a customer theft problem. So for example, he has to think about not alienating customers or employees with his anti-theft countermeasures. He has to think about the organizational feasibility of technological solutions. That is, does his organization have the technological sophistication to implement high-tech solutions? So these are the kind of things that now need to be brought to the fore in order to determine the best alternative. Of course, the process of refining objectives has its own challenges. At the very core, the key issue is that there's inherent conflicts between many of these objectives. For example, anything you do to maintain profitability is going to cost money, thereby threatening profitability. There are also multiple stakeholders in most large decision problems. We have customers, we have owners in some cases, we have the employees. So each one of these stakeholders, each one of these constituencies has a different view of what counts as an effective trade-off. And finally, we'd have lurking constraints like legal issues, insurance issues, and so on that really constrain your ability to act as a decision maker. The decision-making literature shows that one of the biggest mistakes made by individual decision makers and organizations is that when it comes time to generate alternatives, they too quickly focus on a single alternative or a very small number of alternatives. And that clearly limits the quality of their overall decision. You can't make a decision around an alternative you haven't considered. So the goal when it comes time to generate alternatives is to find potential solutions that are consistent with your goals, objectives, and constraints. So in Doug's case, these alternatives could involve security, they could involve different types of technology, training, incentives, whatever. Now, the biggest challenge in this stage of the process is, of course, bounded creativity. That is, as human decision makers, we cannot generate all possible alternatives. We can only generate the ones we're smart enough to think of. And of course, we have bounded knowledge of the situation and bounded knowledge of what's out there. Now, we're not going to spend too much time in an analytics course talking about this stage, about this essentially creative stage of generating alternatives. But there are some well-known techniques like brainstorming, nominal group technique, Delphi technique that can help you and your team be more creative when you're generating alternatives. The final step of the decision process is to evaluate and select. And what that means is we take each one of our alternatives, we model it, we generate some kind of quality score, and then we just rank the alternatives from best to worst and pick the best. Now, the obvious challenge with this is around the modeling. We need to model, for example, uncertainty in various outcomes. We also need to be able to model these multiple conflicting objectives and trade-offs so that at the end, when we get a sorted list of alternatives, we can be reasonably sure that the one with the highest score is actually the best. Sounds easy, but it's very difficult in practice. Now that we have a better understanding of our overall decision process, we can start to think about some of the tools and techniques that we would use to inform each stage of the decision process. Now, note that these tools are really only interesting to the extent that they contribute to better decisions. They are not interesting in and of themselves. So let's start with gap analysis. We'll see in the course that we can do very simple gap analysis using visual techniques, or we can get more sophisticated and use statistical hypothesis testing, things like t-tests and contingency tables. Same with root cause analysis. At the very simplest level, we can use visual techniques, but then quickly move on to standard techniques like linear regression analysis and various types of data mining. When we get to the objectives and trade-offs part of the course, we're going to look at simple techniques such as swing weights and multi-criteria decision making. Now, I mentioned that we're not going to spend much time in the generating alternatives stage because it's beyond the scope of an analytics course, but it's sufficient to recognize that the techniques used to generate alternatives really seek to create intellectual diversity. That is, bring a diverse group of people together and rely on that diversity to generate many different possible alternatives. Finally, we're going to look at multiple different techniques for the evaluate and select stage, everything from simple discounted cash flow analysis to more sophisticated techniques that factor in uncertainty like Monte Carlo simulation and decision trees. So what you will have at the end of it is a roadmap of how to make decisions and some sense of the different tools and techniques which are constantly evolving that you can plug in here and there to help you make better decisions.